بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. This is lesson 1E. The goal of today's lesson is to understand the rulings relating to the ritual bath, the Ghusl. As before, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, will begin by explaining out the integrals of the ritual bath, and then he will begin to discuss the sunnahs relating to the ritual bath. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, the following three actions are obligatory integrals of the ghusl. So these things must happen for your ritual bath or for your ghusl to be considered valid. Number 1, rinsing the entire mouth once. Number 2, rinsing the nose up to the bone once. So both number 1 and number 2 here were considered to be emphasized sunnahs in the wudu. In the ritual ablution, we said that rinsing the mouth once in its entirety is considered to be a sunnah, and also rinsing the soft part of the nose is considered to be a sunnah. So he clarifies here and says that up to the bony part, this is what the obligation is. So the obligation is to rinse out the soft part of the nose. Number 3, washing whatever is possible without undue difficulty or hardship of the entire body once. So anything that can be washed without difficulty from the body needs to be washed, right? So this means that and that the openings on your body, your navel, right? So making sure that you wash, putting your finger inside, for instance, washing the area. Similarly, anywhere else on the body, you don't obviously need to put your finger inside your ear hole. We're talking about the obligation is to wash everything from the outer body. So everything from the outer body that can be washed without difficulty must be washed, right? And if you do these three things, that you rinse out the entire mouth once, you rinse the entire soft part of the nose once, and you pour water over your entire body from the top of your head until your toes one time, you would have validly completed your ritual bath, the ghusl. And this whole process can be done very simply under modern day showers within 30 seconds, right? So it's a very simple, straightforward procedure. Then he says, among the emphasized sunnahs of the ghusl are the following in this order. So note that both here and in the section on the wudu, he mentioned among the emphasized sunnahs, because the basis is that one is gradual in one's study and in one's learning of fiqh, and if everything is given at once, it can be quite overwhelming. And naturally, and the way of the Salaf is that they would take something small and they would bring it to life in their own lives and then come back and take more. So similarly, Imam Shulum Bilali rahimahullah ta'ala, from his wisdom, is that he's giving us a selection of the sunnahs, and sometimes he will give us all of the sunnahs, sometimes he will give us most of the sunnahs, and sometimes he may give us only a selection of some of the sunnahs which of this particular action, and leave the remaining sunnahs for a more detailed text which a student would study later on. So he says, number 1, intention. This is the first sunnah, and this is the basis in most actions. And Imam Suyuti rahimahullah ta'ala said that if somebody doesn't have an intention, then they can't even hope for reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's the intention itself which brings the action to life. That when you intend something in order to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, so this intention to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what makes it acceptable and pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So insofar as if we differentiate between acceptability or validity and reward, then you could say what Imam Taftazani defined the intention as, which is قصد الطاعة والتقرب إلى الله تعالى, right? So what is the intention? The intention is the firm resolve to perform a action. So if you have this, you have the intention. And any reasonable person who intends to do something, right, directs themselves towards something, has an intention to do that particular thing, right? So it's not something that anybody has to think about as such, insofar as having a resolve to perform a given action. Rather, the second part, which is the condition for the reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is قصد الطاعة والتقرب إلى الله تعالى. So intending to gain closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the point where we should direct our focus. So then when we're performing acts of worship and we're performing, the rites of purification, that we do so with an intent to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by fulfilling his divine command, and by doing so in the way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us to do so. And then he says, number 2, washing the hands until the wrists. So just like in the wudu, you would make an intention and you wash your hands until the wrists. And then he says you would wash, he says number 3, washing one's private parts, front and rear. So even if one doesn't need to use the restroom, for instance, then you would still make an effort to wash the private parts, both front and rear, even if they are considered to be clean. Then he says number 4, washing off any filth from the body. So if there's any filth on the body, you'd wash it away so that it doesn't get on, get rubbed onto anywhere else on the body when you're pouring water over yourself. And he says number 5, performing wudu first, followed by pouring water over the entire body, starting with the head for a total of 3 times. So first you would perform in a complete wudu, and in doing so you would have washed out, you rinsed both your mouth and nose, you would have fulfilled those obligatory actions. And then he says, followed by pouring water over the entire body, starting with the head for a total of 3 times. So you'd start from top to bottom, so you'd wash the entire area from top to bottom. This is 1 washing. And then you'd do top to bottom, right, head to toes. This would be 2 washings. And head to toes, this would be 3 washings, regardless of any other rubbing or washing that you do in between. So multiple washings off the arm in order to get the ink stain off, for instance. This doesn't entail that you've washed your arm 3 times. Rather, this would be subsumed within the general washing, as it were. So this is the sunnah method, and there's it's praiseworthy to follow this, but it's also in our times with showers and shower heads, power showers, as it were. You can pretty much fulfill all of these sunnahs in one go by standing under a standard shower head and allowing the water to fall over your body. And if you remain in that state for the extent of time it would take to wash your body 3 times, then this would actually fulfill all of the sunnahs, right? So the sunnah can also be fulfilled by standing under flowing water for the extent of time it would take to wash your entire body, and not the extent of time it would take for you to wash it with your with a jug, for instance. It's just the time it would take for the water to cover your body from head to toe, which is probably not so many moments standing under a shower head, depending on obviously the size of the shower head and the amount of water which is passing through it. Similarly, just like in the wudu, he breaks down the ghusl now into different types, and he says there's an obligatory ghusl, a ghusl which is fard, a ghusl which is necessary, wajib, and a ghusl which is considered to be mustahab. So he says the ghusl is of three types. Obligatory fard, namely when any one of the following things occur. 1. The emission of sperm, sexual fluid, mani, that leaves its normal place inside the body with pleasure, even if it exits without pleasure, for any reason, such as a wet dream, or by looking at someone or something with lust. So basically, if sperm now exits the body, there's two exit points, as it were. So the first is when it leaves its normal place within the body, and the second is when it leaves the organ itself. So when it leaves its normal place within the body, this is the point at which the hukam is now applicable upon this person. So if it leaves this point with pleasure, right, with sexual pleasure, then the ruling is now established such that even if it leaves the actual organ itself without so it left the organ itself without the person feeling any sexual pleasure, then the ghusl in such a case would still be obligatory. So he gives the example of somebody who has a wet dream, or somebody who looks at someone or something with lust. So if they look at someone and then the sperm leaves its normal place within the body with pleasure, then this would obligate the ghusl. And similarly, when it comes to a wet dream, then this is a slightly different circumstance, but they would say effectively it's as if he experienced some kind of pleasure at this moment, and perhaps he forgot about it, and perhaps he was later became unaware of it, so maybe there was something that which he experienced, but effectively it's as if he's experienced something, so he would be obligated to perform the ghusl in this case, in the case of a wet dream, and we'll speak more about this in a few moments, inshallah. Then he says number 2, the second thing which obligates the ghusl, he says the disappearance of the head of the male private organ into the female private organ, or the anus of a living human being whose body is desirable even if without emission of sexual fluid. So the second thing is intercourse. So if intercourse takes place, i.e. intercourse being defined as the head of the male private organ entering into the rear or the front or rear of so the front part of the female private organ, or the rear of any living human being whose body is considered to be desirable. Desirability in this case is obviously subjective, but the point is that it is somebody who can who has a body by which they can actually reasonably engage in sexual intercourse. So this is what is meant by a body which is desirable. This is something how the fuqaha how they express this meaning. He says even if without the emission of sexual fluid, so even if nothing is emitted in this state, the mere fact that intercourse occurred necessitates the ghusl. Right? So the first thing he said was ejaculation, and the second thing he said now is intercourse, and then the third thing, which is comprised of two parts, which necessitates the ghusl and makes the ghusl obligatory. He says the ending of menstruation or postnatal bleeding. So when either menstruation ends or the postnatal bleeding period ends, so the period of bleeding which occurs after natural childbirth, once it ends, this is the point at which it becomes obligatory to perform a ghusl before the lady can continue praying and fasting. Then he says number 2, mandatory wajib, namely for someone who becomes Muslim while in a state of major ritual impurity. So he says now it's wajib for somebody who becomes Muslim whilst being in a state of major ritual impurity. Right, so if they're in a state of ritual impurity and then they say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh, right, so I've become a Muslim, then at this point, and there was no bath which they did before they entered the state of major ritual impurity, and they're entering into a state of Islam, then it would be wajib in this state to perform the ghusl, right? So before they could actually pray. He says, although the sounder opinion, so he continues and says, although the sounder opinion is that the bath is obligatory fard on him and not mandatory. This is merely a technical difference. Practically, it doesn't have any practical implication, other than some legal gymnastics. But the idea is that it's not, so it's fard insofar that the fard is of two types: that which is decisively established in and of itself, and that which is of a lesser degree, which is called fard amali, right? So you have something which is fard ilmi wa amali, so it's fard to believe, so it's obligatory to believe in it, and it's obligatory to act accordingly. And there's something which is obligatory to act accordingly, but it's not obligatory to believe it, right? So believing in it's being obligatory. So this is essentially, it knocks it down to a notch, so that it's essentially the highest type of wajib, right? So saying that it's a wajib kind of equates it to other wajibat, but he's trying to affirm that no, actually it's a higher degree, such that it's operationally it's considered to be obligatory, but practically when you say something is a wajib and something is obligatory in this sense, when it comes to purification, in both cases you have to do it, right? So this is why I said there isn't really much difference between them, although this is a fiqhi technicality. And then he says, number 3, recommended nafil for any one of the following reasons. Number 1, the Friday prayer in Jumu'ah, so Salatul Jumu'ah. So it's an emphasized sunnah to perform the ritual bath for the person who will be attending the Friday prayer, right? So there's two positions on it. It's either for the day itself, but the correct and the stronger position is that it's for the prayer. But if a lady isn't attending the prayer and she performs it with the intention of fulfilling the general sunnah of bathing on this day according to this other position, then she would be rewarded according to her intention. Similarly, the 2 Eid prayers, then this is also considered to be a confirmed sunnah to perform the ghusl for those prayers. Then he says, number 3, entering into the state of pilgrim sanctity. This is also a confirmed sunnah to perform the ghusl, and this is why a lady who is in a state of postnatal bleeding, or she is in a state of menstruation, she would also perform this bath, right, in order to get into a state of ritual, because this is a sunnah for entering into the state, right? So it's not a sunnah in order to pray, so you don't have to pray to enter into a state of pilgrim sanctity, into the state of ihram. Rather, you merely say labbaik Allahumma labbaik, and to enter into this state, the sunnah is to be in a clean state. So this is why the ghusl is legislated in this case. And then he says the day of Arafah, so it's also a sunnah for those at Arafat to whilst they're on Hajj, to perform ghusl at this point for the day. It's also a sunnah for them if they're reasonably able to do so. Number 5, he says entering Mecca. Number 6, entering Medina, the illuminated city. And number 7, visiting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So 5, 6, and 7, these would appear to be generally recommended and not emphasized sunnahs. So although this he called this last title recommended, nafil. So a nafil is conceptually could be broken down into something which is in fact a sunnah and something which is recommended, right? So it can be both something which is sunnah and something which is recommended. So here he listed a number of occasions in which performing the ghusl is considered to be an emphasized sunnah, and then he mentioned some cases in which it's considered to be a recommended sunnah. And there are actually a number of baths which are considered to be recommended whilst one is performing the pilgrimages, and maybe we'll see those at a later point, inshallah. The last thing he mentions is the ghusl is not necessary after any of the following. So we already went through the cases in which the ghusl is considered to be obligatory, which were 4 things, and the case in which it's considered to be necessary, or he said there's a difference of opinion whether that's also obligatory but to a lesser degree, or necessary. But in either case doesn't practically make a difference because there's only one thing. And then he said everything else is a type of recommended. So he says so anything else which happens, it doesn't necessitate the ghusl, right? So he gives us an example. He says the exit of madhi or wadi. So sexual fluids, we can break them down into 3 types, right? So something which is sperm or ejaculate, which is called mani, and then we have something which is pre-sexual fluid, which is madhi, and something which is kind of like a thick or cloudy substance which exits before or after urination for some people. And this is something which is found, and the fuqaha merely speak about things which they see and find. So this was something which was present, so it may occur for some people, and it doesn't necessitate the ghusl, nor does pre-sexual fluid. So essentially when there's no ejaculation, the fluid which comes out is not considered to necessitate the ghusl. And then he says waking up after having a wet dream yet finding no wetness even for a woman. So now if we look at waking to find wetness, then he says there is no ghusl. So if we look at the cases in which there is no ghusl, a person either has a wet dream or he has no wet dream, right? So in the book he says that a person had a wet dream, right? Yet when they awoke in the morning, they found no wetness. So if that's the case, then nothing exited, because we already established that the hukm is affirmed for the person of having to perform the ghusl when the sexual fluid leaves its normal place of origin within the body with sexual desire. And naturally, if that happens, it's going to come out, right? So if it doesn't come out, then that's a sign that it didn't actually occur. Somebody merely had a sensation. So the ghusl wouldn't be obligatory in this case, right? So if somebody had a wet dream and they know it's wadi, right? For instance, somebody is used to seeing it and somebody knows its texture, for instance, because it's something that happens to them often. So they had a wet dream. They had a wet dream and they awoke to find something which is wadi, then they don't have to do a ghusl in this case. And if they didn't have a wet dream, then if they know it's madi or wadi, then they don't have to do a ghusl. Similarly, if they're unsure if it's madi or wadi, they don't have to do a ghusl, right? So in all of these cases, they don't have to do a ghusl. Otherwise, they would have to do a ghusl. But this is a place which is it's not difficult to determine, because if there's kind of like a large, wet, moist patch, for instance, in the morning on somebody's underclothing, then they can make a reasonable judgment. If it's not something which is a regular occurrence, then it's likely to be something like a wet dream. And if somebody felt like they had a wet dream but they don't see anything in the morning, or they don't see anything that resembles a wet dream, then they should make a reasonable judgment that it's a very straightforward thing. There's nothing really complicated about it. You are expected to make a reasonable judgment, and you're not responsible if you are mistaken, right? So as long as you know the fiqh relating to it, and you can make a reasonable judgment, and you say, well, I don't think this is so I think this is presexual fluid, or I think this is wadi, if somebody has wadi, or they say, well, it's either this or this, and there's no wet dream, for instance, then they can act accordingly, right? But being unsure about such matters isn't really an option, right? You should be reasonable, and it's a yes/no question. Is it this or is it this? And if it really comes down to unsurety, then this should certainly not be a regular occurrence. Rather, it should be something which happens very irregularly. And if the case is otherwise, then you should consult. And the third thing he mentions is the insertion of a finger or the like into the female private part. So this doesn't affect, or it doesn't obligate the ghusl, because the only thing which obligates the ghusl is actual intercourse, right? So if something else is inserted into the female private part, such as if she's having some kind of vaginal examination, for instance, or there's some kind of massage or something which is going on in the area, then none of these things would necessitate the ghusl, unless, of course, any of these things lead to an ejaculation, right? So then obviously the reason for performing it is not because something was inserted into the private part, but rather due to the ejaculation. And lastly, he mentions intercourse with an animal without the emission of sperm. So now the fuqaha, they are here to explain out rulings in certain circumstances, and this is right now the context of what we're talking about is the rulings relating to ghusl. So the proper thing to do at this point is to explain out what exactly the ruling is, and this is what the author has done here. So he's told us that intercourse with an animal doesn't necessitate the ghusl unless, of course, there's ejaculation, right? In which case it would be obligatory to perform the ghusl because of the ejaculation, and not because of the fact that there was intercourse with an animal. Now, the proper place for this ruling would be elsewhere in the books of fiqh, and clearly it's something that every reasonable person can see is haram, right? That it's clearly impermissible. But the fuqaha, their point in every case is not to tell you, to make you people of high moral standing. Rather, it's to ensure that your actions are valid according to the Sharia, and that you act, right? If something happens, that you have a way out according to the Sharia, right? So otherwise, the fuqaha tell us elsewhere that they mention things like the animal should actually be slaughtered and burned, right? And there's a wisdom in this, in that if it remains alive, people would always point to this animal and point to this person, and he would forever be reminded about this act. But but if he were to repent, and then the animal no longer exists, then there's no it's almost like the traces of the sin have now been wiped away, and he has a clean slate, and he can continue on with his life. So this is the hasil. Otherwise, this is clearly impermissible. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.